My parents were the first to fall violently ill from the sickness we know now as XoRaX. I can vividly recall my father lying on his bed while his muscles spasmed and he choked on his own vomit. I stood at his side, frozen in place and refusing to leave as I held back sobs. His pupil dilated until his entire eye was like an inky blackness. He tried to speak, turning his head towards me, but opening his mouth only brought forth another torrent of vomit. I remember saying something, but the details is lost on me now. I remember staring into his glazed eyes as his shudders became less pronounced and he was suddenly very still. I let out a wail and ran into my room, unprepared and unwilling to face the truth. My mother was the first to pass, and then my older brother who just turned 17, and finally my father. I had not considered that I could have caught the disease myself. It were in fact contagious. I just thought myself lucky, though tragically lucky at that. I fell asleep in the corner, huddled in the blanket that previously kept my mother warm. Her perfume made the putrid aroma somewhat tolerable, perhaps just enough so that I could drift off. I remember a persistent banging next, a series of muffled inquiries from the opposite side of my locked door. They were shouting for survivors, looking feverishly for anyone who was still alive. Despite the breakout, I rushed to the door and unlocked, and I came face to face with what I would now come to identify as the day crew. Their faces were obscured by large gas masks filtered with some sort of capsule on either side of their cheeks. Their breathing was slow and monitored. Their voices were nearly impossible to hear over the mechanical wheezing. They were covered from head to toe in regulation black hazmat material with orange text reading "Day Crew" on their back. They ordered me to go out into the main hall where I managed to catch sight of 14 other children around my age being told directions and filed into a line. Once the entire group had been examined, we began our trek out into the streets, which was a vision of chaos and destruction. We had heard the noises of looters in desperation for other homes, but we hadn't dared venture outside because we might catch the sickness for ourselves. There were even more day crew that were burning bodies that had fallen into the street, trying to purge the earth as they kept distance from the resulting fumes. We were silently ushered into the back of a large truck that took us south, away from the cities and suburbs into a dense growth of the forest. When the van came to a screeching halt, the door swung open to reveal more J Crew, who ushered us into the forest clearing. We were interrogated about our exposure to anyone with the XoRaX, and if we had felt like we had any symptoms like nausea or vertigo. Though we had all witnessed our family members falling ill and had tried in vain to treat them, we were all perfectly fine in the physical sense. The day crew told us that they were perplexed about our immunity to the sickness, as anyone who came into contact with it was sure to fall just a few hours later. So it was a shock to see that some of us had been living in this nightmare for weeks on end. As they administered more tests and asked more questions, however, we were told that the immunity was tied with a hormone cell that the disease was using to compromise the immune system. And since we were too young to have properly developed it, the disease was unable to make us fall ill. We were told that the day crew wanted to study us, that we would live under the cover of the forest in quarantine. They would hope to extract a cure from our group that could be used to heal the world and get rid of the XoRaX disease. They tried their best to sound positive in light of the situation, but it was obvious that they were doubtful of their efforts and that there was no guarantee for any of the tests to follow through. Still, they kept the mood optimistic and promised us that we would save countless lives with their effort. They built a secluded village in the woods, provided us each with a makeshift house carved into tree trunks around the area. I was led into a simple tree house that had a single bed on the far end and a table in the middle. We were told the first thing in the morning that we were going to have our blood taken, so we weren't allowed to eat anything till then. I was fine with that. I had been hungry for days. The image of my mother, father, and brother crowded my thoughts instead. I didn't get much sleep, and the forest was chirping with crickets, and the muffled bickering of the night crew kept me up into early hours. We were woken the next day and filed into a single lineup to have our blood drawn. When the needles were prepared for us, we were told that we were also going to have to receive a vaccination that would prevent us from going through puberty to preserve the hormones that might lead to a cure. It was never elaborated on at the time that we would never be able to grow up or have children, but it was unlikely to live beyond the first few hours of infection, never mind the next few years, so our adulthood was seen as a necessary sacrifice. And this continued for a few weeks. We would continue to receive vaccinations and be assured that a cure would soon arise, but times were getting desperate. I took to listening in on the muffled conversations of the night crew during the night. It became easier to make out what they were saying over time as they sat beneath my bedroom window next to a crackling fire. I discovered that our encampment was only one of the many surrounding in the area, and that they deduced that the XoRaX originally came from the sea to the west. They passed around horror stories of the people that lived by the shore that were hit the worst. They had gone completely pale and they began to spout gross off their elbows, hips, and toes. They had to be kept constantly hydrated or else their skin would begin to flake and peel. Their pupils had dilated until their entire eye was the color black. As this bit, I thought of my father sitting on the couch and writhing in pain. There was food in the mountains, one assured another. They were gathering it in droves, perhaps to keep it from spoiling. Another spoke up, revealing that they had managed to find expecting women who weren't exposed to XoRaX, and that they were being kept to the mountains to birth their young away from the sickness. The topic came back to the present situation, and they began to discuss our encampment, that our results, while promising, weren't being worked on fast enough. There were accusations, claims, and finger pointing, but at least they settled on keeping their mood positive, that something would eventually come along. They just needed some more time. Discussions drifted back to the horror stories of the West Coast, which clearly sparked sick interest in the group as they talked about the corpses that had been found along the water and drifted ashore, each with deep, black eyes. I rolled over in my bed, unable to listen to this any more of the stories without images of my own family. Staring towards the ceiling, praying that they would manage to find a cure soon and I wouldn't have to hear about people of the West anymore. It had been nearing a month of testing when something went wrong. A few short hours after the latest vaccinations, several kids began complaining of distorted vision. They could see trails of lights in the air, making their way across the plains. While their faces were still covered by the masks, I can still sense the worry they had across their faces. As we lined up to have our blood drawn, one of the day crew became terribly ill and began to vomit through his gas mask. In a frenzied panic, we were ordered to go back into our homes as they led the sick member away into the woods. We were told to come out and organize ourselves into a line for decontamination. After covering everyone with a chalk-like substance, they began to scrub away at it with some foul-smelling liquid until we were assured that we were safe to deal with once more. This excessive procedure became a part of our daily regimen, and it's how we started to call them the scrubs, rather than their official title. We were disillusioned, and it was obvious that they were as well. The visual hallucinations were beginning to worsen. Even though we had stopped taking the vaccinations long ago, some of the kids began to befriend imaginary creatures in the air, speaking to the trail lights. I was horrified that I might start losing my sanity as well. I didn't want to eavesdrop on the discussion over the fire that night, which had gradually worsened with each passing week. With a trail of desperation in their voice, the night crew began to exchange information about the other areas. The food in the mountain had been contaminated, and rumors began to surface that all the births had resulted in defects, with each child being well over healthy birth weight and their eyes far apart. They would most likely succumb to the disease and perish as well. It was decided. The cure that had been tested on the XoRaX-ridden patients hadn't shown any signs of preventing the sickness. Rather, it had simply slowed the progress of the sickness so that it would claim the lives in days rather than hours. While this was a bit of good news, they had focused on how little was accomplished over a large span of time and how anyone with the sickness shouldn't be kept stringing along, but rather destroyed so they could not contaminate anyone else. There was a coldness in their voice. I rolled over in my bed, watched the lights play across my vision, dancing across my eyes until I fell asleep. The scrubs were gone the next day, leaving us behind as their failed science experiment. The other children seemed unaware of this and decided to continue befriending imaginary creatures. In a depression, I sulked off to bed, only to suffer violent bursts and spasms and shivering in the process. I drifted in and out of sleep that night, having one reoccurring nightmare after another. When I awoke, I heard something pass through my doorway, something that couldn't possibly be there. Rolling over, I reluctantly looked up into the air and watched a trailing ball of light float around my house before descending toward my bed. "Hello, Link, wake up. The great Deku Tree has summoned you."